Yeah, I'm Kasia Bryc. I've been with 23andMe for, I guess, a number of years now. And you know, one of the first things I was really excited to do when I joined 23andMe was we have this amazing database, which is even bigger now, that can tell us and inform us about, you know, the genetic ancestry of African Americans, Latinos, and European Americans across the United States. So that's the title of the paper, which we've nicknamed, you know, DNA USA, or Genetic Landscape of the US sometimes, just because it's a mouthful. And so we have this amazing resource. So basically, I think in order to understand the data that we used in studying these cohorts of African Americans, Latinos, and European Americans, I think you first need to know a little bit of background about 23andMe and how it works. So let's see if I can move the slide forward. So 23andMe is a direct-to-consumer genetic testing company. You can order online, get a test tube in the mail, send it into our lab with some saliva, and we genotype your DNA and then return the results to you through our online web portal. So our genotyping technology is a Illumina microarray and something like 600,000 variants. And the important part that becomes relevant later as I talk about sex bias is we have SNPs that are on all 23 pairs of chromosomes, including the X and the Y, and the mitochondrial DNA as well. So normally I give this talk in about an hour, so I'm going to try and get through that much quicker. So a lot of these slides I won't have time to go through. So but I will leave them for folks to look through. It's a fairly long paper, as I was telling Dennis, and it's a lot to cover, and that's because we had a lot of data. So we have currently over 5 million customers. And the demographics of our customers somewhat mirror the demographics of the US. So in that, I mean, the majority of individuals in the US are of European ancestry, likewise our customers. But we also had a large number of Latinos and African Americans in our database. And because these were the 3 largest cohorts, we decided to focus on European Americans, Latinos, and African Americans, because at the time, those were the biggest sample sizes. So we could be able to say something interesting about fine scale ancestry differences. And so I just want to point out that about 80% of customers consent to research. And so don't worry if you're one of these, the data is always aggregated and de-identified. And we're very grateful to customers who do participate in research because it makes things like this possible to increase scientific knowledge. And in this case, about the genetics of the US. So one of the things that I have been always interested in is studying patterns of admixture and understanding admixture in present-day individuals. And so just what I mean by that very briefly is if you have 2 ancestral populations who are previously separated and they begin mixing, in the first generation, you're going to have individuals who have, in this little cartoon example, 1 chromosome from each ancestral population. But then as the population continues to mix, you're going to have individuals with segments of ancestry from these 2 ancestral populations, and their chromosomes will be a mosaic. And so this is the ground truth, but of course we only have genotype data, so we need to make an inference in order to say anything about ancestry, about what the ancestral origins of one's DNA is. And at 23andMe, we use an algorithm we call Ancestry Composition, and this is what we use both in returning results to customers, as well as was the basis of this paper. So this is my Ancestry Composition. In short, we paint all of your 22 pairs of chromosomes and your X chromosome if you have 1 or 2. And according to where in the world we estimate them to be from. And the sort of high-level view of how ancestry composition works is if we take your pair of chromosomes and we phase it and get a haplotype for each chromosome, we compared the patterns of genetic variation on your chromosome that we don't know the ancestry of, so it's in gray, against individuals whose ancestry we do know. And so that's what I call reference data sets from these three populations, blue, purple, and pink. And we chop up the chromosome into windows. And basically for each window, ask which one of these corresponding populations is it most similar to, and sort of go along the genome and paint it according to where we see patterns of genetic variation most similar to what we see in your DNA. And we can do that for both chromosomes. And if you look at it cumulatively, we get the sort of global genome-wide ancestry proportions. But we also provide local ancestry, so along the genome ancestry. So that's sort of a high-level intuition. In fact, ancestry composition is a little bit more complicated. So we phase your genotype data. So we get haplotype data is sort of the start of the ancestry composition algorithm. And we use SVM to do the heavy lifting of classifying which population a particular window is from. But then we also have a couple more steps. We use an HMM to do sort of smoothing between or across windows. And then we also do a recalibration step that increases our precision and recall. And again, all of this relies on public reference data sets, which we get through multiple sources, including publicly available data, samples that we've collected or collected in collaboration with others. And then, of course, our very own 23andMe customers who participate in research and have told us that they have all 4 grandparents from a single population can be used as well. So the output of this is calibrated assignment probabilities. And so probabilities are slightly hard to visualize, so we then can apply a threshold. For example, in this case, if this is probabilities of belonging to particular populations across chromosome 1, we apply a threshold, and any particular window that is above that threshold gets assigned as that ancestry at that threshold. And so that is what in turn gives us these colorful chromosome paintings. For example, the individual on the right who's an African-American with one grandparent who is of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. So that's the algorithm, and it's very, very accurate. So basically precision and recall upwards of 90% on the continental level. And so our estimates are pretty good for doing exactly what we're interested, which is looking at admixture in the Americas in particular. So a priori, we know that Americas have been the site of a lot of mixing over time, especially within the last 500 years. We know that there have been a lot of migrations from Europe, voluntary and also involuntary migrations, such as through the transatlantic slave trade, which sort of you can look at estimates from slave trade logs and ship logs and sort of have an idea of what migrations were happening from where. But then, you know, of course, the question is what does that translate into in terms of the genetic ancestry of present day individuals? So we're not the first to look at this problem. Studies of African Americans and Latinos have shown that the African ancestry in these individuals is primarily from West Africa, which makes sense in light of the origins of slave trade, and that there's a large amount of variation in ancestry proportions, not just across individuals, but across populations. And there's been some evidence of sex bias in ancestry contributions. So what we were hoping to accomplish in our paper was basically to use this amazing fine-scale data that we have of individuals from all across the US and look at, first of all, how individuals self-identify and how that corresponds to what we estimate their genetic ancestry to be, and then also understand better the patterns of genetic variation across the United States. And so I've told you about how we get our genetic ancestry estimates, but we also need how people self-identify. So we invite customers who participate in research to answer surveys about themselves. And so you might get a question like this if you're on the 23andMe website, asking about how you self-identify. And so that's the other piece of data that we used as the basis of the study. So our sample sizes were big at the time, and of course could be even bigger now, but we were looking at over 150,000 individuals, and about a third of them had geographic information. So what I mean by that is fine scale geographic information from which state they were born in or live in. So without further ado, what do we find? So we know that African Americans have a wide variation in African versus European ancestry proportions. So this is just a classic structure plot. Each vertical bar is an individual colored by the proportion of ancestry from each of these populations. And so that's not a surprise, but what we were able to do with our fine scale state location information was to look at differences in ancestry across the US. So in particular, we see the highest levels of African ancestry on average in states in the South, as high as 83% in South Carolina, and lower levels of African ancestry in African Americans from other parts of the US, including the West and Northeast and Northwest. But we can also look at Native American ancestry, right? So African Americans do carry Native American ancestry, and the average proportion is actually very low, and so it's sort of hard to look at the mean across each state, but you can ask instead how many African Americans from a particular state carry 2% or more Native American ancestry. And you can see the highest levels are in Oklahoma, where upwards of 10% of African Americans carry Native American ancestry, and that makes sense in terms of historical context, because Oklahoma, before it was a state, was called Indian Territory, and it was the end of the Trail of Tears migration of Native Americans that happened in the 1830s. And if you look at the 1860 US Census, Black slaves actually comprised a substantial proportion of the population at that time. So we can also look at Latinos. Unsurprisingly, Latinos have a large amount of Native American ancestry, relatively, but then the highest levels of Native American ancestry are from individuals in states bordering Mexico, so in the Southwest US. And we can also look at the corresponding European proportion, but what's most interesting that we saw was if you look at the proportion of, because we have sub-regional ancestry estimates, so we can estimate how much is European, but we can also estimate how much of an individual's ancestry is Iberian, meaning from Spain and Portugal. And if you look at Latinos compared to European Americans, normalizing for the proportion of European ancestry in an individual, the relative proportion of Iberian ancestry in Latinos is much, much higher than in European Americans as a whole. So the levels of Iberian ancestry in European Americans hover just over 0 to 10%, but in Latinos, it's a much larger proportion of their European ancestry. And that's, again, consistent with what we know about the history of Latin America. And finally, we can look at European Americans who have a large proportion of European ancestry on average. But we can also look at sub-regional European ancestry estimates. And what's interesting is, there's all this data from the US Census, 2000 and 2010 US Censuses, where individuals report their ancestry or ethnic origin. And so the US Census collects this for various reasons of their own. But we can use this data to compare our genetic ancestry estimates with what people think their ancestry is. And so we saw consistently across lots and lots of different ancestries, this geographic correlation between individuals who, for example, on the left, self-identify as Norwegian or having Norwegian ancestry, I should say, versus the estimate of Scandinavian ancestry in present day 23andMe customers from these parts. So you can see this correlation of both what was known historical migrations and the genetic ancestry of individuals today. And this pattern sort of shows up across lots and lots of different European subpopulations. So French-German ancestry, Italian ancestry, as well as if you look at British and Irish ancestry, it's very correlated with when individuals identify as American. And that could be for a number of reasons, perhaps due to early British or Irish migration, or rather, alternatively, the lack of subsequent migrations from other parts of Europe. So European Americans carry European ancestry. That's sort of not a surprise, but we could also look at African ancestry in European Americans. So these are individuals who self-identify, again, as white or European American, but we consistently saw that European Americans, especially from parts of the South, carried levels of 1% or more African ancestry. So again, the average proportion is quite low if you were to plot a map of the averages, but if you look at individuals who carry these low levels of African ancestry, it's quite a high proportion. And that's consistent with the fact that these are regions where there are more African American individuals, suggesting that there is a correlation between the ancestry that you carry and the demographic state where you live. And so individuals, you can look at European Americans who carry Native American ancestry, and again, there's a surprising fraction of European Americans do carry at least 1% or more Native American ancestry, and that I think this is the first systematic analysis to show that European Americans do carry non-European ancestry. We looked at a number of ways to validate that these sort of often low levels of non-European ancestry were indeed valid. We did a bunch of sanity checks and validation efforts to show that this was not just some sort of spurious artifact. So I'll show one example of some lines of evidence that we used to show that what we're picking up on through ancestry composition is probably reflecting true non-European ancestry. So if you look at Native American mitochondrial haplogroups, so haplogroups A, B, C, and D are primarily found in the Americas and nowhere else. And so if you look at individuals who, either European Americans or African Americans, who are estimated to have at least 1% Native American ancestry, you see that the rate of these mitochondrial Native American specific haplogroups is actually quite high, much higher than the 1 to 2% Native American ancestry. And so first of all, we see that both in European Americans and African Americans. And sort of as a control, we looked at individuals who told us that their 4 grandparents, so 4 GP, were from a particular country in Europe. And if you look at, so these are Europeans, not American, European Americans. And if you look at the rate of these Native American haplogroups in those individuals, you just don't see them. And the rate is much, much lower. If you exclude Spain, because a large number of these Native American haplogroups in European individuals was actually found in Spain. If you look within Spain, it's less than 0.1% of individuals that carry these Native American specific haplogroups. So that to me suggests that we really are picking up on true non-European ancestry, confirming that, like, indeed the history of admixture in the US is quite complex. So the last point in terms of ancestry is that we have estimates of ancestry genome-wide, but we can also look at the X chromosome specifically. So the X chromosome, again, because of the inheritance pattern, you have 2 X chromosomes if you're female, 1 if you're male. Whether ancestry comes in through males or females is going to affect the proportion of that ancestry on the X chromosome in subsequent generations. And so you can then, using a very simplistic back of the envelope calculation, use comparison of genome-wide estimates versus the X chromosome to make inferences about the proportion of individuals from each population that were male and female. So if you look at the X chromosome versus the autosome across all 3 cohorts, so African Americans, Latinos, and European Americans, we consistently see higher levels of African and Native American ancestry on the X chromosome, and correspondingly lower levels of European ancestry on the X chromosome. So that is statistically significant across all of the highlighted comparisons there, with the p-value less than 0.01, excuse me. And actually, if you look at European Americans who carry non-zero levels of, who are estimated to carry non-zero levels of African and Native American ancestry, that last box also becomes statistically significant. And so, like I said, we can use those estimates of genome-wide versus X chromosome ancestry proportions to try and make a sort of guess at the contributions of ancestry that came from males and females in each of these cohorts. And so if you look at the proportion of females from African, European, and Native American ancestors, it's always consistently lower levels of European females and higher levels of non-European females across all 3 cohorts. And if you look at specifically African Americans, it's quite extreme, something like 3 times as many European male as European female ancestors. And this is, again, a very simplistic model, and one could do some much more complicated analysis like Amy Goldberg has done. But that's giving you a sense of the sex bias and ancestry contributions, which we show is not just in African Americans and Latinos, but also in European Americans. So of course, that tells us about the ancestry of each of these cohorts, but we then wanted to look at, can we learn anything about self-identity? So how people self-identify as African American, Latino, European American, and that relationship with genetic ancestry. So this is a slightly complicated plot, so let me just quickly walk through it. If you look at the proportion, so take everyone who is in the study and look at the proportion of individuals who have a particular bin, 2% bin of African ancestry, and a 2% bin of Native American ancestry. So that's one of these dots, one of these circles on this chart, and then color that chart, that pie chart, in by how the individuals in that ancestry bin identify. And so if you look at the individuals who have higher levels of African ancestry, they tend to self-identify as African American. Individuals with higher levels of Native American ancestry tend to self-identify as Latino. And individuals with lower levels of both, and correspondingly, therefore, higher levels of European ancestry, tend to self-identify as European American. But I think what's interesting is not just that these cohorts, tend to identify according to their ancestry, but rather the change in identity is what I think this study was able to shed light on. And so in particular, if you just consider African Americans and European Americans and look at individuals with between 0 and 100% African estimated ancestry, the proportion of individuals who identify as African American is, unsurprisingly higher for individuals with close to 100% African ancestry, and very low for individuals with 0% Native American ancestry. And what we are able to see is that around 28% or 30% ancestry, individuals with less than 30% African, estimated African ancestry tend to identify as European American, whereas individuals with more than 30% tend to identify as African American. And I think that's the first study that was able to really delineate this relationship between self-identity and genetic ancestry. So in conclusion, you know, the US is admixed at very many levels, and the patterns of admixture in present-day individuals do mirror these known historical migrations and historical events. And so that's the first evidence that what we see in present-day individuals really does reflect the history, the regional history. And we saw sex bias and ancestry contributions across all three cohorts that we looked at. And of course, there is a relationship between self-identity and genetic ancestry, but it's very complex. And you can use genetics to shed light on social phenomena such as passing, which is where individuals with African ancestry self-identify as white, or pass, so-called pass into the white community. And so in conclusion, you know, we see that history, sociology, and genetics are all just incredibly complicated and woven together, especially in the US, which is a really super interesting population, part of the world to study because of the complex recent migrations and history. So I'd like to thank first and foremost 23andMe research participants for answering questions about yourselves and participating in research that made this work possible, and my collaborators at 23andMe and at Harvard Medical School. And I should say that if you found that this data is super exciting and interesting, we are looking for individuals to help us learn what we can from the data at 23andMe, and we are hiring. So thank you very much.